First Things, episode number 33.
I seem to be lost.
And so you're working around the clock so you don't take time for yourself to feel like an actual human being.
I used to feel like no matter how hard I worked, I was just spinning my wheels.
Trying to be perfect, we try to have everything in place at one point in time, and you can't.
Hello, my friends. Welcome back to First Things, the podcast dedicated to practical productivity based on modern research. My name is Brandon Vaughn, and it's my goal to help you apply productive solutions to your life to help you live with less stress, greater passion, and amazing results. We are continuing our study today over the assertiveness episodes, how to become more assertive. We are working through the assertiveness workbook, and there is a link to that in my show notes at firstthingsproductivity.com/33. You can go there, you can find a copy of this book, a link to buy a copy of this book, and I would highly recommend it as a resource in your library. Very great book, as well as another book that can be slightly controversial, When I Say No, I Feel Guilty, a very old book on assertiveness, and I like it quite a bit. It gives a lot of examples of how to speak to people in different circumstances. The reason why I say it's controversial because from an academic perspective, I do see that it crosses over some into aggressiveness. And I think it blurs the lines a little bit between assertiveness and aggressiveness, but I still think it's a very valuable resource to look at. And I love it just because of the examples that it gives and some of the techniques that it gives for how to communicate assertiveness. Although, again, when you pick this up, just be a bit careful because it can cross over a little bit, I think, into aggressiveness type of styles of communication, but it's still a very good resource to know about. Last week, I mentioned a course at Creative Live called The Power of Body Language by Vanessa Van Edwards. And I reached out to Vanessa to see if she might consider being on this program to talk about body language, and she's agreed to that. We're going to work out the details. I'm not sure when it would happen, maybe sometime later this year or during the summertime, but I'm really excited about that. She had an amazing course on body language, and it does fit quite well with this whole topic of assertiveness as well. And if we don't get around to it during assertiveness, we'll spend a good episode just talking about this. And I'm excited about that. If you didn't check out that course, I would encourage you to do that. And it was an amazing course just to talk about the different aspects of this idea of body language and visual cues and how we can present ourselves in a better light just by our facial expressions or the way that we use our hands or the way we use our arms or the way that we sit or the way that we stand. I mean, all these different types of things. And I've heard some of this before, so it wasn't brand new to me, but I just had never heard it in one collective arena like this. Many of the things I had seen were in book form, and to me it was always hard to really learn this when you're reading about it, because you're learning about body language and facial expressions, but you're reading about it, and it was always a very hard thing for me, and seeing a visual representation of this was amazing to me. So I'm really looking forward to that. So today we are in Chapter 3 of the Assertiveness Workbook, which is entitled Overcoming the Social Barrier. And this involves a quite myriad of things that we want to look at. Just social barriers. What are the different types of social barriers that we face in trying to establish a habit of assertiveness? And this can come from everywhere from history and what people expect of us, all the way to gender type of issues that we're going to get into as well. When you start trying to change a habit, especially a habit of how you communicate with people, and remember we said that assertiveness is a communication style. It's not your personality. It's how you choose to communicate with a person. When you change that, you may find that people around you resist your efforts to change. They will resist your efforts to become more assertive. Even if there's something that will help your relationship over a long period of time, they will often resist this. And I think this is especially true for any of you listening to me that typically use a passive style of communication. If your usual style of communicating with people is very passive, I think you're going to find that people will resist your attempt to change, to become more assertive. But I also think it happens for everyone. So if your style is more aggressive, if your style is more passive-aggressive, I think you'll also find the resistance there as well. But in talking to people, I find that most often it's the passive style of communication. When people switch from that to a more assertive, it shocks people, and they're not quite ready for that, and often they will resist that. And it's nothing necessarily bad to the other people in your life. Sometimes it can be, but oftentimes it's just the fact that people become accustomed to communicating with you on a certain level or a certain way. And if you've built up a pattern of years of communicating to people in a certain way that is maybe very passive, and you give in And if you basically just do what anyone asks of you to do without question, and then all of a sudden if you start saying no to that, or if you start creating boundaries in your life, it will shock people, and they're not going to be used to that, and they will sometimes resist that because it breaks their comfort zone as well. People fear change, and you may fear that change as we're talking about becoming more assertive, because all of a sudden you're looking at moving into areas of your life you have never moved into before, so that can produce a type of fear of change. Well, for the people in your life, for your family, for your colleagues, for your boss, for any of these types of people, they also experience that type of fear of change as well if you start changing around them and they don't understand. Now, sometimes, and the author mentions this, for some people, especially maybe those close to you, you may want to tell them that you're changing. Hey, by the way, I've realized in my life that I typically communicate very passively sometimes, and I've done this for a variety of reasons, but I wanted to let you know that I am working on this, and you may see some changes in how I talk to people or how I react to situations, and I just wanted you to know. And that can be helpful sometimes, but other times it may not be. Sometimes you just may want to do it and not tell people. Sometimes not telling people can be a good thing, because if you treat your life as an experiment, you will know whether or not some of these techniques are actually working from the reactions of other people. But if you do worry that people may react, or if you're getting too much of a backlash reaction to some of the things that you've changed in your life, then it may be a good point to actually talk to people and just let them know. You don't have to go into a long dialogue of this. It can be rather short and sweet, just a minute of conversation of saying, hey, by the way, you may have noticed this, or I saw that you kind of frowned the other day when I did this, and I just wanted to let you know here's what's going on in my life. So consider doing that if you think it's a big issue or not, or, just use it again, be aware of it as you go through life. Here's what the author says in the book. He says, when you change your way of relating to others, they will wonder what's going on. Why have you changed? What does it mean? Do you still like them? Do you still need them? Are you angry? Are you depressed? Are you planning something behind their backs? Are you the same person they've always known? What's going to happen to the relationship? Any change in style, even a welcome one, can be alarming to the people close to you. It signals that other things may need to change as well. And quite honestly, it may take a little bit of time to realize that you're still the same person, that it isn't that you are trying to change your personality. No, it's a communication style. And we've said this over and over again, how assertiveness is a communication style. It's a choice of how you respond to life. It's not who you are as a person. It's not your personality trait by any means. It's just your communication style. And sometimes it takes people a little bit of time to realize that you haven't changed. You're still the same person, but you are communicating with them in a more open and honest manner. As the author says in the book as well, he says, you aren't becoming a completely different person after all, and the change isn't going to be all that sudden. This is a project, not a revolution. And I love that quote. This is a project, not a revolution. So you are simply going through your life as a project, as an experiment, and saying, in this area in my life, I'm choosing to communicate in a different manner. Now, that may come across to people as a revolution, but you just have to reassure them that you are still the same person, or just realize that over time they'll get used to this new side of you, this new way in which you are communicating with people. But it is something that we have to think about. You have to be ready for this resistance, because if you think that changing this style of communication for you is going to just be a easy thing and everyone's going to love it, you are mistaken because it's not going to happen this way. And you have to ask yourself some very serious questions. Am I ready to deal with the fact that people aren't going to be supportive of this? Am I ready for that? Because they may not be supportive of you, and you have to be ready for that possibility in your life. Are you willing to allow them not to be supportive? Because remember, a big part of assertiveness is that we do not deny people their choices as we value our choices. So we are going to value our choices. We are going to allow ourselves to have choices, but not in such a way that we manipulate other people from having their choices. No, we give people the dignity to choose what they want to choose to think and do, but not rob ourselves of the ability to choose and think and do at the same time. So in this very fact of establishing an assertive style of communication, to be congruent with that, to be in line with that, we've got to allow people to be able to process it the way they're going to process it. And are you willing to do that? Are you willing that people may be upset with you, or they may not support you, or they may misunderstand you? You've got to be ready for that as you are embarking on a new style of communication. You've got to be anticipating that people may do this. And it may be that they're all supportive of you, and if that's the case, then congratulations. But I can tell you from my experience, that's not going to usually be the case. And I think for the majority of people listening to me, if you are trying to move from being aggressive to more assertive, or you're passive aggressive and you're moving to assertive or passive to assertiveness, you're going to find that people aren't always going to understand that. And they aren't going to always appreciate you and back you for that. The people closest to you, your friends, your family, your coworkers, they've learned to interpret your behavior. You have become predictable to them in some manner. They know this is the way that you respond, and they like that because people don't always like change. They like to be able to look at you and know this is what he will do. This is what she is going to say in a certain circumstance like this. And we like that predictability. And when you take that predictability away from people, it's not always a good thing. And remember, who established those patterns in people's minds in the first place? You did. So don't blame them for getting upset with you. You're the one who communicated in a particular style and has gotten people used to that particular style. So if they react negatively to that, be a little patient with them because you are the one who established those patterns in the first place. Usually people aren't necessarily being mean or inconsiderate. They have just gotten used to a particular thing. And again, people just don't like change. The author says this in the book, a key point. Don't blame others for expecting passivity or aggression from you, especially if you were the one to create those expectations. What could you say if they don't understand? One option will be to go back to your old style, get enraged, get passive, get even. Are you willing, though, to stay assertive and give them time to adjust? I think that's a very important point that, again, we have to remember. We have to be ready for setbacks. If you're not, it will derail you. And if you're not ready for this type of response, you will often find yourself reverting to your old styles of communication. So you'll get mad, or you'll get even from a passive-aggressive style, or you'll go passive, and you'll just start agreeing or not saying anything. You've got to be willing to stay assertive and allowing them time to adjust to that. Now, for those of you listeners who have been heavily using the passive style of communication, again, to go back to something I mentioned earlier, people like to feel powerful. They like to feel like they're in charge. They like to feel like they are in control in some fashion. I think this is true of all of us in various degrees. Some people become more addicted to this type of thing, but I think in general, we all like some sense of control. We don't want someone to tell us what to do all of the time. We may like it some of the time, but we don't like it all of the time. We like to have some amount of control. It gives us some sense of security, whether that's good or bad. We're not going to talk about on this particular episode, but it does. It gives us a sense of identity, a sense of security. And for some people, if they can control you, they feel better about life. It's extremely convenient for them. And if you are used to a passive style of communication, you have given people control in your life. And naturally, they will resist when you try to take some of that control back because no one really likes to lose power in their life. So the author says this in his book. He says, expect resistance when you assume control over your own life. And he also says this, when you start being assertive with someone, things usually get worse before they get better. Now, all of the things we're talking about today may sound rather negative. It's like, okay, you've convinced me I want to be more assertive. I want to give myself the dignity of choice in life. And now you're saying it's going to be bad and it's not always going to. And all I'm trying to do is give you a realistic picture of this, because I think too many times we will fail in new habits if we expect it to be easy. It's the same thing with exercise. I find myself in times when I finally get back into a good regimen of exercise, how difficult it is for me. And a lot of that difficulty is because I expect it to be easier than what it actually ends up being. And I expect me not to be sore, or I expect me just to lose a bunch of weight all at once, and that doesn't happen. And it frustrates me because I have unrealistic expectations. I don't realize that there really is going to be a place where it's not going to be good for a while, and then it's going to get great. But I have to go through that if I'm expecting that. So now when I go through an exercise program, I realize that I'm probably not going to like it for the first couple of weeks, and I'm going to resist it. And when I get up in the morning, I'm not going to want to work out, and I'm not going to feel like working out, and I'm going to want to sleep in instead. And I've come to realize that's just going to be there. So don't paint this rosy picture that everything's going to be great. And although it's a little bit negative perspective, perhaps, I think it's a more of a realistic perspective. You've given, especially for my passive style communicators who are listening to me, you have deliberately chosen to give people choice in your life for years now. And you need to go into that realizing that people don't want to give up some of that control. And therefore, it may not be great when you first start doing this. And you may encounter some resistance, you may encounter some failures, but as long as you're realizing that that may be there, you can press through it. And that's my main message today, and the main message from this particular chapter of the book is to don't give up just because you have setbacks. Expect that you may have setbacks and don't be alarmed by the fact that you do. We dealt a whole episode on the fear of failure. And so many times when we fear that we won't succeed, especially right away, we give up and we just don't even try. And in this whole thing of assertiveness, it comes back to the same thing. If you did this 99 times and you failed every single time to really implement it, don't give up, because it's going to be the next time that you very well likely could make a breakthrough in this. And what would it be in your life? I've said this before. What if you could look back in time or look forward? You could predict the future and realize that it was the 101 time. It was the one time after 100 attempts that you finally had a breakthrough. Would you keep doing it? And so many times we get to the 17th failure or the 28th failure or the 51st failure, and we say, I give up. It's not going to work. It will never work. But what if you knew it was the very next one that you would make a breakthrough? The fact is, we can do anything we put our minds to, as long as we're persistent with it, as long as we can deal with the failure and not let it become part of our identity. And it's the very same thing with assertiveness. If you really want to be assertive, if you realize that this is the better path for your life, a better communication style for you, then you've got to just persevere. You've got to stick with it in spite of failure, in spite of kickbacks from people that may not necessarily like this new part of how you're communicating with them. And it's all because they're not used to it. And they will get used to it after a while. And if they don't, then you have to severely question whether it's a type of relationship that you want to remain in your life. So the author gives several guidelines for how to set boundaries and how to deal with being very stubborn in creating this habit in your life. And let me read these for you. He says, first of all, only set boundaries that you are willing and able to defend. So if you make threats that you cannot keep, such as I'll quit this job, or I'll leave you, or I'll ground you for a year, or I'll never speak to you again, etc., people will not take your attempts to be assertive seriously. So first of all, you shouldn't threaten people, because that is an aggressive style, or it could be maybe a passive-aggressive how you do it. You're not trying to manipulate people. But if you are going to set a boundary, then set one that you're willing and able to defend. So stay away from threats, stay away from extreme type of boundaries like I'll quit or I'll leave you or something like that, and set these things that you're willing and able to actually defend. The second thing he says is don't start getting assertive when you are strained to the limit. Remember that the relationship will get even tougher for a while. Pick a time when you have the strength to handle the pressure. So this goes to a basic advice that if you consider this as a project in your life, you may not want to try to become assertive in all areas of your life all at once. You may want to pick certain things to experiment in. So maybe it's a relationship, or maybe it's a child, or maybe it's a coworker, or maybe it's your boss. But maybe it's not a good idea to do all of them all at once. You may want to pick your areas that you focus in and the areas that you feel like you can succeed fast in, or maybe you want to pick the harder one and go after that first. But don't feel like you have to do them all. And if you're extremely strained because of work and pressures in your life, you may want to definitely pick and choose which ones that you're going to go after and not try to become assertive over everything. The third thing he suggests is to do not back down. When you set the barrier in place and the other person begins pushing against it, be prepared to keep to the rule. Otherwise, they will push harder the next time. So when you decide that you're going to become assertive in a particular area, you've got to really follow through with that, because otherwise the other person will realize that all they have to do is push a little bit harder and it will cause you to back down. So you've got to be ready for that type of thing. And then the fourth thing he suggests is don't become assertive with everyone in your life at once. This is what I mentioned just a while ago. You probably won't be able to stand having all of your relationships becoming more difficult at once. So pick one person at a time and work at it and get better at it and learn from your failures and learn how to do it better over time. And this is a very good rule that I would suggest we all put into place. Now, the last thing that the author talks about in this chapter is a very important one, but it can also be very controversial, and that is a gender problem. The gender issue that we all face, whether we are male or female, is a huge problem, a huge social barrier that we face in becoming assertive, because we're all programmed through media and through parents and friends and schools and everything around us about what it means for a man or a woman to be a man or a woman, how a man should behave or how a woman should behave. And we're given these scripts in life that many times we take on as our identity without ever questioning the very fact of what it means, or is it true, and how do I deal with this? People are basically raised with expectations of how you should behave or what you should do just based on your gender alone. And we have been ingrained with this, and sometimes we don't even question this at all. So the author gives several examples of this for women and then also for men. So let me go through some of these that he talks about for women. So any of you women who are listening to me that are trying to become more assertive, I will tell you that in many ways it's probably the most difficult for women because of this type of scripting. Men have their challenges as well, as we're going to get into. Very different types of challenges about assertiveness than women do, but women have been scripted for so long with certain types of behaviors that can trap them from becoming more assertive. And by the way, men can have some of these as well as women having some of the issues that males have. So there isn't a clear cut here. I don't want to suggest that males can't have these particular issues right here, but more often than not, women are very much scripted and programmed to think this way. For example, you were raised to serve others. The author says this: if you experience this barrier, you receive the message that your job is to support others in their lives rather than live your own. Rather than resulting in a healthy balance between living one's own life and supporting others, which is a very good idea, this leads to a tremendous guilt at doing anything just for yourself. Because your guidance for your life comes almost entirely from the demands of others, you may have difficulty even knowing what you would like, let alone doing it. So this type of scripting or programming can lead to a very dominant passive style of communication because your whole perspective of life is to serve others. So you must do everything for them and not for yourself. And there can't be any balance of this type of thing, and therefore it leads to a whole style dominance on that passive style of communication where you are basically there to serve other people. And by the way, I think serving other people is a great thing for both men and women. We want to be servants of other people. And I haven't ever really spoken about this much, I think, in these podcasts, and we may at some future point, but I think this is a great way to live your life, to serve other people. But at the same time, you can't become another person's slave. And this is what a passive style basically does, is you become another person's slave. Choosing to help other people is a great thing. As the author said, a healthy balance between living one's own life and supporting others is a great way to live your life. But as long as you aren't neglecting your own life. And this is a barrier that we have to get past, especially for women, many, many times. The second thing he mentions, you were raised to be nice. So your job is to be polite. Not a bad goal in itself, but here's the definition of nice that many people hear when they hear this, that being nice means never to say no, never to disagree, never to have a boundary between you and others, and never to reveal your own desires or opinions. This is the lie of what many people hear about the word nice. You need to be nice to them. Well, what does that mean? If you're nice, it means you never say no to someone. You never disagree with them. You never put up a boundary and say, I'm sorry, I can't do this. You never say, this is what I think we should do in this case. No, being nice means that you give in to them. You never say no to them, and that's not what being nice is. Being nice to someone is to respect them. It's to value the fact that they have a choice, they have a thought, and you're not going to rob them of that. That's what being nice means. But it doesn't mean that you can't express your thoughts, and it doesn't mean that you can't have boundaries in your life. It doesn't mean that you can't disagree with someone, but you're going to respect them. You're not going to try to manipulate them. You're going to honor them in how they see things, and you're going to give them the dignity to allow them to think things, allow them the dignity to choose the path that they're going to take in life. That's what being nice is. And we've got to get past, especially for many women who've been trained this way, that nice means never saying no. No, you need to say no sometimes. And you can say no and still be nice. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive to each other. And they don't mean the same thing either. So being nice doesn't mean that you never can say no. They're not the same things. And we've got to start separating that in our life. The third thing is that your relationship is your worth. Now, this is something that can affect men as well, but it really can affect women. So let me read what the author says. He says, without a romantic relationship, you are nothing. As a result, you can never run the risk of damaging a relationship by raising your own needs, wants, opinions, or personality. In other words, by actually being there. This belief may come from upbringing, peers, or the media or culture at large. And I've seen this attack many women where they don't have an identity if they're not in a dating relationship with someone, if they're not in a relationship with anyone. They can't function. They don't even know who they are anymore because they need someone in their life. And I believe this is because of our upbringing and programming that we've had in this. Now, the fact is, relationships are great. Whether you have friends or you're dating someone or have a spouse or anything like that, those are great things to have. But the fact is, you don't have to have any of those to have your identity and purpose and meaning in life. We just think we do. And this can become a trap. I hope you can see why this could be a trap for assertiveness, especially if you're dealing with this issue. Because if your relationship is your worth, then how can you ever tell somebody no? How can you ever disagree with someone or voice your opinion about something? If your relationship is your value, if your relationship is your identity, then you need that other person too bad in order to even say no to them, in order for you to take a different path in your life. The next one that he mentions that can be particularly for women is the fact that you are the family maid or the family butler. Members of your family believe that child care, housekeeping, cooking, and all of those things are solely your responsibility, not because you agreed to this or because you have the time, but because of your gender. Women who work identical hours to their mates often find that they are still expected to take the lead at home. Again, very much a programming issue of how we have to deal with life, especially for women, and how this can become a barrier to being assertive. Next one, you are the old family retainer. Now, what this means, he says that in family situations, women are often expected to take a more active caretaking role. Brothers, for example, may assume that their sisters will take the lead in caring for aging parents. You are assumed to be the one who has to make all the sacrifices in terms of family and caretaking roles, whether that be for parents, aging parents, whether that be for kids and children, or anything like that. It's always expected, usually of women, and therefore it becomes another barrier to dealing or having an assertive style of communication in your life. The next thing, which I'll lump into one category, is that women often are expected to be the junior partner or the junior employee. So your partner expects that you are the more passive and you're more agreeable. So you're the one who has to give in. Your partner is the one who will make all the big decisions and even most of the little ones. Or you're asked to do the more menial task, or you seem to be easier to push around than men. And this can be a trap in the workplace, especially for women, and especially for women trying to adopt a more assertive voice, a more assertive form of communication. It's expected in many cultures that women are supposed to be the more passive, that women are supposed to agree to things and aren't supposed to be argumentative or not supposed to voice their opinion. You're always meant to be the junior one. And sadly, there are many cases where women are turned down for promotions because of the fact they're a woman. I've seen this in my own life, that you would have a man and a woman, and it would be a job that would require a lot of assertiveness, a lot of voicing of opinion, and many times it would be given to a man who had lower qualifications than a woman with greater qualifications, and I believe it was a gender issue. Now, I don't see that all of the time, in fairness, but I do see it some. And this can become quite a barrier for females who are trying to become assertive, especially in a workplace, because you're expected to become a passive person in that type of environment. And I want to tell you that's not the case. But again, if you're a woman and you've seen this in your own work and you decide, I'm going to become more assertive, well, first of all, remember, we're not talking about aggressiveness. We're not talking about passive aggressiveness. We're talking about you choosing what you think and do while allowing the other person the dignity of choice and thought as well. So we need to remember that first. But second of all, like I said earlier in this program, you've got to expect some resistance. And there's a lot of programming in the workplace around this. And therefore, you can really probably expect some resistance in this type of environment. And some workplaces are better than others. I've seen some workplaces where women were in charge and they were the vice presidents or the presidents or different things like that. And it was very much common that they would voice their opinions and nobody questioned that. And I've seen in other areas where it was questioned because it was a very male-dominated type of environment. So just be aware of this. And the last thing is another programming message that women often get is that you're not as important as a man. And this goes back to a lot of ancient type of cultures, that in public settings you've noticed that you do not receive the same courtesy as men. So sometimes you may be less likely to obtain a loan, you may have more difficulty receiving adequate service, or people may behave in a condescending manner that seems related to your gender. And I'm obviously not a woman. You can probably hear this by my voice. I was raised by a lot of women, just grew up without a father in my life. So I have deep respect for women. I've always had deep respect for women. And I don't want to say I understand exactly what it is to be a woman who faces some of these types of programming messages. And I also don't want to say that it's always happening. I do see a lot of changes in our world over the last 10 or 20 years being better about a lot of this stuff, but this stuff is still out there. And even if it's not directly in your workplace, there is definitely these types of messages that are being filtered to women all the time about women should be the caregivers and you should sacrifice everything for that, or that you should be passive at the workplace, or that your whole identity on this earth is to be in a relationship with someone. And if you're not in a relationship, then you're nothing. You mean nothing. Your existence is worthless on this planet. And I still see this message all the time. You just turn on TV or watch commercials, and your worth is how you look. And if you have wrinkles, then oh gosh, that's terrible. Nobody's going to like you anymore. All these messages that we are feeding women, and it can definitely hinder you as you try to establish an assertiveness style of communication. So be on the lookout for these things. And definitely, I don't think this is an exhaustive list. And I would love to hear from some women through either my Facebook page or my blog site or anywhere about what are some things that maybe the author missed from your perspective that women do deal with. I would love to hear from that. So now let's talk about men. What are some barriers that men face to be assertive? Now, this may seem quite astonishing, especially maybe to some women, that men actually face some heavy barriers to be assertive as well. And this can cause people to be passive. It can also cause some aggressiveness from males as well. The first one the author mentions is that a man is a man. I'm a man's man. So basically, in this case, you are raised to believe that real men are aggressive and they're pushy and they're rude and they're demanding rather than asking for what they want. They demand it and they have tempers and they start shouting at people and they start doing all this stuff. And your job is to be in control of others. That's the whole purpose of a man. A man's supposed to be in charge and he's supposed to control. Even if it comes down to manipulating, it doesn't matter. He's going to do whatever it takes to be in charge of something. It's a sign of weakness to let others do what they want. And as a result, you have adopted a very aggressive stance. So a lot of male listeners to me, if you deal with a lot of aggressive type of styles of communication, this could be a strong foundation for why that's in your life. This idea that because you're a man, what it means is you must be in charge at all time and you can't let other people be in charge or to voice their opinion. You've got to be in control. You've got to be demanding. You've got to be pushy about things. You've got to mouth off at certain things. You can't just let things go by. And it very well could be a trap that we face ourselves in. But maybe on the passive style, the second thing that males can get very much trapped into is to obey or else. And some men, he says, were raised by very demanding, overpowering authority figures who expected passive obedience, almost like a military school. I am the sergeant, you are not, and you will obey and you will do what I tell you to do. And many males have been raised in those types of environment. Any attempt to be assertiveness was viewed by that authority figure, often the father, as a challenge to his rule and was vigorously struck down. This can result in a fear of being assertive coupled with a fear of being an imposter when you stand up for yourself, as if people will see through you. And many males who are dealing with a passive style of communication may have been raised under this type of environment, that you must obey me at all costs, and therefore we've been raised around a very passive style of communication. Now, just as women have often been programmed to be the caregivers, and you must sacrifice everything in your life to be the caregiver, men are often programmed with the fact that they can have no self, and they must be the breadwinner. They must be the selfless warrior on behalf of others. You can never have personal interest. You can never take breaks. You don't need nurturing or intimacy in any way. You're a rock. You're solid. You're emotionless. You are this powerhouse in which nothing's going to shake you. And as a result of that, you can't ask for help. You can't share emotions. You can't actually show people weakness, that you have emotions, that you need things in life. You can't speak of your own needs. You're not even aware of how to speak of your own needs, because after all, you're a man, and a man has to be that selfless warrior who goes into battle and doesn't think of himself, but lays down his life, for other people. And this is ingrained many times, among children again. This idea, of playing soldier and doing battles, and basically, it's all about that. We're going to win this thing. And life is a matter of winning something. It's not a matter of building communications and relationships with people. It's about control. It's about the fact I must win. And if I have to, I will sacrifice myself to win, because what I feel and what I want doesn't matter. Now, can you see how that would hinder being assertive? Because being assertive means that you're in tune with what you want. And it's not a matter of manipulating someone else, but if you are that selfless warrior mentality, it will definitely hinder you. And the last thing he mentions, which is kind of tied into that, is that many men are raised with that feeling that a man can take it. And if you are overwhelmed, that's a sign of weakness. If you're overwhelmed by work, that's a sign of weakness. So taking on a heavier load than anyone else is almost a source of pride. It's a source of identity. Look at all that I'm doing. I'm a man. I can take it. Give me more. I can do this. And yes, I'm not sleeping any and I'm not taking vacations, but I can do this. The consequence is basically men also have a hard time saying no to things, but they have a harder time saying no than women do because it's a different identity crisis. For a man, many times to say no is a sign of weakness because a man should be able to do it. And if you say, no, I can't, it's admitting a weakness to many men. And that's a threat to their identity. But as a result, they have unreasonable workloads. They risk burning out. They risk exhaustion. They will sacrifice relationships. So is it any wonder that many men, in climbing up the ladder of success, get to the top and destroy all their relationships? They have no relationships with their children or with their significant others or anything like that. They destroy it on the way up. I've quoted this from Stephen Covey before. He says, as an example of this, he says, wouldn't it be horrible to climb the ladder of success rung by rung by rung to reach to the very top and realize that the ladder was leaning on the wrong wall the entire time? And I think about that so many times because men especially can get in this mode that I've got to be a man and I'm going to be victorious in life and I'm climbing up this ladder of success rung by rung. And I hear this all the time from these entrepreneurs. I was listening to someone that I deeply respect. I'm not going to mention the name on this show. Have deep respect for this person. I've talked to them on numerous times, benefited from talking to them many, many times, and they were basically talking about their entrepreneurial lifestyle. And this person was struggling with a lot of stuff in their life. They basically told me, that they're making all of this money and they have all this freedom and they were doing all this stuff. And I was like, wow, this is great. But then they started talking about how generally they work 60-hour work weeks every week and how they're working from the minute they get up to often 8 or 9 o'clock at night, often working on the weekends, on Saturdays and Sundays. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, that doesn't sound too exciting to me. Yeah, when you're saying you're making like $300,000, $500,000 a year, but you're working yourself to death, doesn't sound like you're spending time with your kids. It sounds like your health's kind of deteriorating. And what benefit is that giving you in your life? And I have to come back to say a little bit of that, maybe a large part of this, but at least a little bit of that is the fact this guy is a male. And therefore he's a man. He can take it. And therefore I must be conquering something. And that's the dilemma of most males, is most females want to feel valued. They want to feel as if they're the one that someone would die for, whereas most males suffer from this mentality that I must conquer something. I must overcome something. I must be the warrior that climbs that ladder of success rung by rung. And so many entrepreneurs I see do this very same thing. They go off and they say, well, I'm quitting this, meaningless job of working 9 to 5, and I'm going to be my own boss, and I'm going to conquer this world. And look, I'm making 3 times as much money as I used to. And I'm thinking, wow, that's great, but your life is falling apart. You haven't talked to your spouse in months. You haven't talked to your kids and spent any time. You're working weekends. You're working basically from 6 a.m. in the morning to often midnight. And I don't see the benefit of that. But, that's a person that can't say no. I can't say no to this. I must do this for my business. It's the same type of thing. And males can be very subject to this type of barrier in their life. Now, again, women can deal with that as well. I'm not saying that a woman can't say, that a woman can take it. Well, yeah, a woman may have dealings with this type of barrier as well, but I often find that men especially do. And the author says this at the very end of the chapter. He says, there are no easy solutions to these problems faced by men and women. One of the most important tasks is to become aware of the beliefs and fears about assertiveness that can be based on gender. So I think that's a good stopping point for us today. And I know this program today probably has been more negative than positive. Talking about the fact you should probably expect setbacks and people are going to push back. And we have all this programming inside of us, especially from a gender perspective, that many times can thwart our attempts to become assertive. And basically, the whole point of today is to really become aware that this is not always going to be an easy habit to develop. It's going to be an amazing, worthwhile habit to develop, a worthwhile communication style that you want in your life, but you need to realize there's a lot of things against you. So today's not necessarily a negative thing as it is more a realistic thing of saying this is what's in store for you as you begin this, so don't let it derail you. And that's the positive slant I'm trying to make on this today. It's not that, oh, you've been programmed and no, it's the fact that you can become more assertive in your life, but you need to be aware that there are these roadblocks in front of you, and there are these potholes in the road that you're traveling, and be aware of that, so that if you do encounter a pothole, if you do encounter a barrier in your life, you don't become shocked and dismayed and retreat back into an old style of communication, that you don't give up at the first sign of failure, but you keep pressing in, that you realize that's just part of this. That is just part of your journey to become more assertive. You're going to be dealing with some programming issues. You're going to deal with some people that aren't going to always understand this, and that's all part of it. Don't be shocked by that. Don't be alarmed by that. Don't be set back by those types of things. And that's the main message that I want to give today with all this material. Now, we're going to dig into this a little bit more next week, because next week the whole emphasis is about the belief barrier. So what are some of the beliefs that we have, some of the stinking thinking that we have? And it all goes back to what we mentioned the previous week, that when we deal with things in life, it's the situation that we appraise and then we respond to it. Well, that appraisal is a huge thing. How we see that event is a major thing to deal with in terms of being assertive. So our beliefs have a big, big part in that. So we want to dig into that a little bit, and we've dealt with many times the whole issue of stinking thinking, but we're going to deal with it again next week. And then after that, we're going to go into what he calls a reality check, and then we're going to start getting into some main things of how it means to be assertive, what it actually means, how are we going to deal with this in nonverbal ways, and our facial expressions, our eye contact, how we deal with our body, our tone of voice, our physical appearance. We're going to talk about all those types of things. We're going to talk about how you can be present in the moment, what that means about giving your opinion, how you can receive positive feedback, how you can deal with confrontation. We're going to get into all of those specifics. But we have to deal with the fact that there are things that are going to try to push us back to these old ways of communication styles. Be resilient to that. Do not worry about setbacks. Do not worry about failure. Keep your eye forward on the goal of this habit and keep pushing forward no matter what. Well, that wraps up this episode on assertiveness, of dealing with barriers, social barriers. As always, please consider leaving me a rating and a comment on iTunes, on Stitcher, Zune, BlackBerry. Haven't had any comments of late, especially on iTunes. Would greatly appreciate any of my new listeners to go on there and leave me some feedback and leave me a rating. Would love to see that, love to read your thoughts and comments on that. Speaking of comments, if you have any comments about this episode, I do have a discussion area set up at firstthingsproductivity.com/33. If you go all the way down to the bottom of that page, there's an area there that you can leave me comments. You don't have to register for that. We'd love to hear your feedback, especially when we're talking about gender things. Any of you male listeners, if I've missed something that you deal with and struggle with, tell me about it. Let me know. For any of my women listeners, I'm not a woman. So I don't know if I necessarily represented, if this author represented some of the struggles that you face. If there are things that are missing that you deal with or have dealt with in terms of being assertive that wasn't mentioned, would love to know about it. You can also let me know about that on Facebook, on Twitter, on just different areas like that. Would love to hear your comments about that. So until next time, remember this. Barriers in life are never a hindrance to overcoming or establishing a new habit, as long as you don't allow them to be, as long as you anticipate them, as long as you are ready to deal with them in your life. So as you begin a habit toward becoming assertive in your life, do not let your programming thwart you from this habit. Do not let any social pressures to become a particular style of communication, to go back to a particular style of communication. Don't let that thwart you. And even if you do go back, even if you do fail, go back again and keep pushing toward this new habit no matter what. Don't beat up on yourself. Don't condemn yourself. Learn from your mistakes and go back at it again and keep pushing toward this assertiveness that we've talked about. You having respect for your choices and thoughts while giving dignity to someone else to also have that same right. This is what assertiveness is all about. How that works out practically, we'll get into in the next weeks. As always, embrace today with passion and intention, and don't die with your music still inside you.